What happens when the serial killer isn't just on trial? He's also your opposing counsel. Rodney Alcala, one of the most sadistic killers in U.S. history, ended up representing himself in court, and former Deputy District Attorney Matt Murphy, he faced him head on. Now, you've seen Matt on ABC 2020 and, well, frankly, everywhere these days. He's also the author of the Book of Murder. Welcome back to Killer Genes.
So happy to be here. Thank you for having me back.
You have so many incredible cases that are getting the light that it deserves with incredible investigation and the prosecution. But I just really want to stick to serial killer Rodney Alcala. We're going to deep dive into that, what it was like to prosecute against him. And then, we're seeing the evolution and just the stereotypes of the old serial killer really modernize in today's era. And it's fascinating to me, and it's timely because you're working on a new book on serial killers, right?
That's right. That's right. So the first book, thankfully, the Book of Murder's done very well. The Audible particularly well, which I don't understand because I actually hate the sound of my own voice. But yeah, so book number two, we just submitted the proposal. I prosecuted 13 serial killers in my time in the DA's office. I spent 17 years in the homicide unit, and so I think there was a lot of meat left on the bone, so to speak. I was the Orange County prosecutor for Joseph D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer. I did Rodney Alcala, the dating game killer. Andrew Urdialis, which was another big one that we did. So yeah, so I think it's going to be interesting. I really enjoyed writing the first book a lot more than I thought I would. So eager to dive into book number two.
And it's going to be captivating because you certainly have the cases. Rodney Alcala, for people that don't know or hearing his name for the first time, or the dating game killer, he was a killer of the 60s and 70s. So break down what is modus operandi, if you will? What was his operation? How did he pick his targets? And to your knowledge, how many victims were there?
So just a little background first on Rockin' Rodney, as he came to be known with the cops. He was active. First of all, he grew up in East LA, and contrary to a lot of the myths out there about serial killers, like one of the common questions you get when you're actually working homicide cases against people like Alcala is what could have driven them to do that? Like what drove them to hate women so much? Or, we all sort of have this idea in our mind of these horrifically abused guys that are somehow forced into this or compelled. And the classic character is Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, who was murdering women to steal their skin so he can metamorphosize. And that's mental illness. Okay. The reality is guys like Alcala oftentimes come from stable homes. They have success socially. Alcala had a genius level official Mensa level IQ. He graduated from UCLA Film School. He went to Cantwell High School, which is a very well regarded college prep school in East LA. His brother graduated from West Point Military Academy, was an officer in the Vietnam War, came back a war hero. So he had a mother who loved him. He was never bullied by anybody. He was never molested by anybody. And went on to the lead investigator, Craig Robeson, who's now a Superior Court judge and a great guy. One of the smartest people I know. If you do the math on Alcala and you figure out how prolific he was and where he was and the times that he was released, um, Craig Robeson, Judge Robeson, thinks he killed well over 100 people. So um, he first hit the radar for law enforcement in 1968. He kidnapped and almost murdered a 8-year-old little girl named Tally Shapiro in Hollywood. So Alcala had just graduated from UCLA. He's got this little bungalow in Hollywood, and there's a good Samaritan who sees him pull over, and she's walking to school. And Rodney Alcala is literally the don't accept rides from strangers guy. And so she gets in his car, and the dialogue later we learned was he said, "Oh, I can't take rides from strangers." And he goes, "I'm not a stranger. I know your parents." So in the mind of an 8-year-old, that was enough. She got in the car, doesn't drive her to school, drives her to his bungalow. And there's this good Samaritan who sees this, who it doesn't look any better in 1968 as it would today, and sees this man lead this little girl into this house. So he found a payphone because it's 1968, and he calls it in. And there's a police officer named Chris Camacho. It was his first day back on the job. He was shot in Vietnam, and then he was shot again during the Watts riots. And it's his first day back on the job. He gets the call, and it's like he knocks on the door, and Alcala says, "Hey, I'm just in the shower." And it's one of those things like, he thinks I could wait and be polite, or I could kick the effing door in. And that's what he does. And he decides to kick the door in, goes in and sees naked guy running out the back of this little duplex, and sees this little girl naked on the kitchen floor with a barbell over her throat, with more blood on the floor than should be able to come out of an 8-year-old. And he chase the bad guy, save the little girl. He saves the little girl. She's in a coma for 32 days, but due to his heroic life-saving efforts, she actually survived. So he disappears, and in the house, the police find thousands of photographs of young women, young boys. Sometimes they were naked, sometimes not, but all in positions of vulnerability with Rodney Alcala. Like some were out, like in the forest, some were in rooms, God only knows where, and
Because
a
he
lot
was
of those
also
were.
acting as a photographer. That was his cover.
Yeah. He was a graduate of UCLA Film School. He was an actual photographer, and that was his come on line. He would come on to people on the street, to young women in particular, and say, "Hey, I'm a professional photographer. I can win a contest," or "You're beautiful. You should model for me." And that was his ruse. And a lot of serial killers, they really do develop like a technique to get these people, to lure them into positions where they can murder them. And a lot of those guys tend to focus on sex workers because of the nature of that lifestyle. They will agree to go into vulnerable positions with strange men. And so that's one of the reasons why, from Jack the Ripper, up on through so many famous serial killers, they tend to focus on sex workers or prostitutes. And
Now, the fact that
Alcala
he
didn't.
focused on younger girls, does that lead you to believe he was a sexual predator before he was on anyone's radar? And did he then escalate into killing? Was he a predator first and foremost?
Well, that's a great question, and that's one of the areas that I think is really underdiscussed in the literature. And that is you. I spent 4 years in sexual assault before I got to the homicide unit, and I got to homicide and I was on a search for Buffalo Bill. Like looking for serial killers that were horribly abused and mentally ill and all that. And what I kept encountering were these arrogant a-holes that were just like the serial rapists that I've been dealing with in sexual assault. So that's a great question, because look, they are pretty much the same guy. The serial rapist who breaks into the home and puts a knife to a woman's throat and rapes her and does that over and over again is their personality types, the way they operate, their narcissism, their arrogance, their relationships with women, their relationships with other people, their ability to hold a job, their backgrounds are almost indistinguishable. It's like the same guy, only one of them sexually gets off on the murder aspect, and one of them, it's not a part of their deal. They get off enough on the rape part, on the fear, on the sadism. But some guys like Alcala, they take it to that extra step. Like Alcala, like Bundy, John Wayne Gacy is another one. Randy Kraft is another one. There's the list goes on and on. And the FBI has studied this, and the vast majority of serial killers either sexually assault their victims, or there is a sexual component where there's a sexual motivation to it. Even if they just commit the murder, they're still motivated by the sexual thrill they get from that. So that's a really interesting question, and I think that it is largely understudied in the literature.
Now, is it fear? Is it resistance? I mean, that sexual thrill aspect, the person is in fear for their lives. They're I'm sure screaming or fighting in some cases. Is it the control? Is it the inflicting pain? Is it the domination to control a life or death moment?
I think yes to all of the above, and a much longer list that we don't even have time to go through. It's human sexuality essentially, and a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. But I think that is really what we're dealing with on that. They're first and foremost they're sexual predators. So as far as the proclivities, Some people are into feet, some people are into lederhosen, some people are into latex. Like there's a million kinks that people have. What these guys are into, they're into that list. They're into, some of them are into inflicting physical pain. Some of them are into watching people die. Some of them are into choking. Some of them are into stabbing. It's an endless list of of the human sexual compulsion where these guys, their wires are crossed and that's what they get off on. And and look, my perspective on this, I'm not a psychologist, but I dealt with them professionally for 17 years. And like Rodney Alcala is a good example of a guy that one of the common characteristics you see, and I think it's kind of an interesting recipe of a little bit of narcissism, high intelligence, arrogance, a bunch of different things. A lot of them want to represent themselves. Ted Bundy represented himself. Rodney Alcala in his third trial represented himself. I had a serial rapist named Douglas Hopper who represented himself. The list goes on, and it is one of the things. It's almost like they go to school for it. They love to collect trophies of some sort. Some of them are really into jewelry, like Rodney Alcala was. Some of them like take pictures, like Rodney. That was one of the things that he was into also. Um, there's some of them will take rings, some of them like earrings, but they love to collect trophies and they love to represent themselves in court.
I'll actually add on to one case that I've worked for many years, Thomas Randolph, which he's an accused wife serial killer, and he represented himself. And which so interesting about, I think, the shift in perspective about how serial killers are truly bred. He was coddled. He was the light of his mother's eye, apple of her eye. He could do no wrong. So he admittedly gained this entitlement and he gained this ego. Anything is possible. I could do whatever I want. Nobody tells me no. Is that so? Two questions. One is, does that entitlement go to I can get away with anything? And when it comes to a court of law, does it give them that confidence to think I can win this? Or is it just about theatrics and they don't really care the outcome at that point?
They care about the outcome because they all want to get away with it. And I think a lot of them, they really think they're smarter than their lawyers. But yeah, that is, you talk about Randolph and his childhood. And again, this is something that is truly underrepresented in the literature out there. And people love to key in because it's understandable. We want to think that they're all victims of abuse. And if there's a common thread on so many of the ones that I dealt with, it's exactly what you just said. It is that they're spoiled as kids and they're entitled. And that was my Andrew Urdialis case. He was a Marine who was very active. There's been almost no media on that at all. And that trial took us 6 months. He's convicted of murdering 5 women in Chicago, and we had 5 victims in Southern California. And then he was in the Marine Corps. He was deployed to the Philippines. He was deployed to Korea. I know that this guy has had victims out there as well. So he was a very super violent, prolific sexual predator slash serial murderer who, um, when he was a child, as a working class family in Chicago, very loving family, intact. Both parents were in his life. He was the youngest of about 1 million kids in this very Catholic family, and his one of his oldest brothers uh, heroically died in Vietnam fighting for his country, right? So, but the mother, understandably, was devastated by that, and her reaction, according to all the family members, was she coddled Andrew Urdialis, and he was first in line for at the swing set for everything, and really spoiled that kid. And for a lot of those guys, when they get older, suddenly the world isn't so kind, especially if they don't turn into the Adonis that their mother sees them as, and they get out there and they start facing some rejection by women. That is definitely a component of this, and it makes people uncomfortable, and you don't hear that much. People are very comfortable with this whole abuse structure. Their
Well, where
horrible
did that
abuse, and
came
it
from the
turns them into
FBI
serial
though?
killers.
Right? Didn't that come from the FBI and other agencies that were trying to hunt down these guys? Now, is there a sector of serial killers that was that at one point, and it's
Sure.
just
Yeah, no,
evolved, or how did this?
definitely. Look, there's tons of people that I mean, look, sexual abuse and physical abuse is ubiquitous in society, but that's like connecting that as there's it's called the correlation cause myth. It's a fallacy. It's like simply because we have a bunch of them doesn't mean it was the cause. And look, there are so many people that have been sexually abused that we don't even know about as kids that have just never spoken about it. And I've had one of the questions in sex cases that the judges always ask the prospective jurors, and on any kind of case, really, it's a standard question. Have you or anyone close to you ever been the victim of this or a similar crime? That's asked whether it's burglary, robbery, vandalism, whatever it is, they have to ask that because they're trying to explore for bias. So when that question has been asked in child sexual abuse cases, and I did a million of those when I was in sex, that's about 85% of the cases you deal with are sexual abuse of children. And I've literally had juries where the prospective jurors, you got 12 in the box, it's called, and then you have four alternates, and you have a gallery full of people that aren't being questioned yet. And I've had every hand go up. Like every single juror has either been the victim of sexual abuse as a child or has
Wow.
somebody close to them. And I mean, if you think about it, we all have been either victims of sexual abuse as kids or have somebody close to us, and like really close, like immediate family, who's either perpetrating or a victim, or a lot of people have both in their families. So it is incredibly common. And the vast majority of people that have that happen to them don't turn into monsters and they don't turn into predators. And plenty of them are able to go on and have perfectly healthy lives and sex lives and bond with partners and all of it. I mean, it might be challenging depending on the nature of the abuse, but it is so common. So this idea that that sexual abuse as a kid is some sort of a vampire bite, where we know what happens if you get bitten by a vampire, right? We get turned into a vampire, right? Or Walking Dead, for the Walking Dead fans, we know what happens if a zombie bites you. So it's almost this comforting thing where if we can avoid the monster, if we can identify the monster, if you can avoid the abuse, that means you're not going to be an abuser. And that is a myth. It is a myth. That is something that you see over and over again. Rodney Alcala was never abused, and we know that because the way it works for death penalty cases is the defense has virtually unlimited resources, and a proper police investigation. You want your cops, you want your detectives to really explore. Once you identify who the guy is, and once you take him off the street and arrest him, the next phase, it's like a race to mitigation, is what it's called. You want to interview every single family member because you got to know, what was the childhood like? Was the child abused? Was there an issue? Because you want to know that. You want to know what you're dealing with before you make a decision whether or not you're going to seek the death penalty. So you want to know that. So he had three trials, Rodney, ours being the third, where between the prosecution and really good defense lawyers with unlimited resources, every single person in that guy's life was interviewed at one point or another. There was no bullying, there was no sexual abuse, and that is as disturbing as it may be. And it's anecdotal. Look, I only did 13. That's. I mean, I got a sense, but it's only 13. I don't think that's. People would say that's scientifically insignificant, but I can tell you what. That is when you start seeing those trends and you start seeing those patterns. And it makes people uncomfortable. And a lot of people want to spar over it, but I'm telling you, a lot of them, it's if there's one common thread, it's that they were entitled and they were spoiled as kids.
So when this came to your desk, how many confirmed murder victims did you have to work with for the prosecution?
Well, when it landed on my desk, we had one confirmed, and that was Robin Samso, who was a 12-year-old girl that he murdered in 1979. So the case went up. He was convicted in 1980 the first time, went up, and it was reversed by the California Supreme Court. The Chief Justice then was a woman named Rose Bird, who was an anti-death penalty activist before she went to the Supreme Court. She took great pride in telling everybody that no death penalty case ever survived her review. So she reversed every single death penalty case that came across her desk. And the so it gets sent back down. He's tried again, convicted again, sentenced to death again in 1986. It goes up again. That time it gets through the California Supreme Court, lands with the Ninth Circuit, and the Ninth Circuit then reversed it. And so it winds up, he was suspected of a series of murders in New York because after he fled LA, got out the back door, remember he's naked, he winds up on the East Coast, and he's working for, or now, well, he was started at NYU Film School. He really wanted a film degree with a fake name, John Berger, and he was working at an all-girls sleepaway camp in Vermont. and there was a rainstorm, and two of the little campers run into a post office to get out of the rain, and they look up, and there's the FBI 10 most wanted list, and they're like, that looks an awful lot like Mr. Berger. So they told the staff that's how he got caught. So he gets extradited from New York, comes to California, and this is something that fires me up every time I think about it. This guy kidnapped, raped, and almost murdered an 8-year-old girl. It's predatory in every way. The prosecutor on that case let him plead guilty to a simple child molest, which even back then in what was known as indeterminate sentencing in California, he still had a life sentence. They still could have kept him, and the California Board of Prison Terms released that guy after 34 months in state prison. And that's when he went on his killing spree through the mid to late 70s. And there are 100 dead women at least that essentially their lives were cut short because of a series of, in my opinion, grossly incompetent decisions by the DA who gave him that deal, and by the parole board that released him. And I I'm sure most of them
But
are
also,
gone now.
unfortunately, it's fueling his arrogance and his entitlement, the fact that
Exactly
he
right.
keeps getting away
Yep.
and these convictions keep getting overturned. That's making him feel that he
Yeah,
could do whatever he wants and continue on. I mean,
that's right. So
he's sick, so he did continue on.
yeah, you know what though? He's not sick. He's not sick. And that's a broad euphemism. Not disagreeing with you on it. It's a term we all use. But
No,
it's
I love
important
that because as soon as I said it, I
because
was like,
words,
well,
no,
because
words matter.
right,
Words matter.
right.
That is exactly what they thought when he came in. And these guys are incredibly manipulative. And the psychopaths are charming, and they are manipulative. And anybody that's interested, you should watch the Ted Bundy tapes where he interviews with reporters. But that was the thing. Rodney Alcala, quote unquote, air quotes here, got the help that he needed. And so that's why they released him. There's no fixing these guys. It's not they get off on it. There's nothing wrong with the moral compass. They absolutely know that this is wrong. They just don't care. That is the thing about a
That's
psychopath.
the difference, right? How would you
A
define one?
psychopath is not a recognized mental illness in the DSM. So it is their personality traits, it's character, but it is not schizophrenia. There's nothing making them do it. They're totally lucid. They understand right or wrong. They just don't care. The world exists to please them. Women are objects, and that is how they operate. So not sick. Not sick. They are, as one of my old bosses said, they're assholes. That's their thing. They're
But just on a psychological level in psychiatry, that's fascinating. The fact that there's this whole chapter of society that, like you said, they simply do not care. They do not care. They want to do it, so they're going to do it. So how do you classify these people? Because everyone wants to be put in a box.
well, the
Psychologists,
Americans. No, there's been in the literature, the American Psychiatric Association has published articles that estimate that about 1% of the population are full-blown psychopaths. Now, so that's 1 in 100 people. Okay, so that is we have all met multiple psychopaths over the course of our lives. The vast majority of them don't murder people. The vast majority of them are that coworker that you can't stand who doesn't care about anybody else, or your neighbor who keeps lets his dog bark all night long, like they just don't care about other people, and that's doesn't make them a psychopath, but that's kind of the classic character trait of that, and we all encounter them. A very small minority of them will actually become serial killers, very, very small, but it's not a mental illness, and it's a really important distinguishing characteristic. It's a personality trait. It's a character thing. They know right and wrong. There's no devil on their shoulder telling them to do it. They're just turned on by it, and they do it because, for lack of a better term, they get off on it. It's fun for them. They enjoy it.
okay, personality trait, born or bred?
That's another great question. It's chicken or egg. I think it's a combination of both. I think that it's probably people that are susceptible to it in the first place, which is certainly not everybody. And then there's a combination of environmental factors that essentially develop and allow that missing soul to blossom into the sadistic sexual predation that we see in so many of these people.
Is that please correct me if I'm hearing it wrong, that pure evil exists And it's nurtured throughout life or developed throughout life? Or how would you explain if there is pure evil within somebody, or if it's just we are products of certain things that we just give into?
Well, so part of my job, Melissa, as you know, I work for what's known as a vertical unit. So I would actually go to those scenes. I've walked about 100 murder scenes before they move the body. And, you know, what we would do is I would go to the scene, and then if there was an issue concerning cause of death, I would go to the coroner's office and observe the autopsy. And then after we filed charges, and this is on all murders, not just serial killers, I would meet with the victim's family. And when you meet with the mother of a murder victim who was raped, tortured, and murdered for fun, I can't think of anything on the planet Earth or in human experience that there's a better descriptive term than evil to describe that. So that act, in my mind, and evil, the origins are religious, but it is really the only word that fits that. And then somebody who does that, and they realize that, and there's newspaper articles, and they see pictures of that person in life, and they know what they did. They know that there's immense human suffering because the moms, sometimes they'll kidnap them, and before they're found, like my Samantha Runyon case back in the day, we didn't find her for a while, so there's these emotional pleas from the mother. Imagine all that, and then that person goes out and does it again. If that's not evil, then evil does not exist. It's the best descriptive term. I'm not personally religious, but it is, yes, I believe after seeing that, evil absolutely exists, but so does good. And the good you see in the crime lab personnel who show up at 3 in the morning without complaint, the detectives who work 18-hour days to solve these cases, the jurors that really soberly consider the evidence in these things and follow the law, the judges that have dedicated their professional career to it. You see so many good people that come in and clean up the mess, or to the extent it can be cleaned up, and at least do all the hard work to prevent that predatory monster from ever being able to get out and hurt anybody else. So there's absolutely evil, and in my view, there's also absolutely good.
And when it comes to getting out and hurting somebody else, which was the case with Rodney Alcala, it was your turn. And you ended up locking him away until he died. But tell me about what that was like. You had one case at the time, been there, done that through the conviction process. Going in, what were you going to do differently? And then I have to know, the moment you found out that he was representing himself, did you laugh? Did you think this is a sure win? I mean, how do you process that information?
So with Rodney, again, they so many of them want to represent themselves, right? And I had a whole caseload, by the way. Like, I carried about somewhere between 20 and 30 murder cases at any given time. So this is one of the many cases we were working on. But of course, when you're actually in trial, it becomes your only case that you can deal with, especially with something like that. So it's called going pro per, or in some jurisdictions they'll call it in pro se, and that's just Latin for you're defending yourself. There's an old adage. Uh, anybody who represents themselves has a jackass for a lawyer and a complete fool for a client. Okay, so that um, it's bittersweet because on one hand, it gives them the power to really gum up the gears with things that they're going to want and ridiculous objections and things like that. On
You
the
mean
other,
the theatrics of it all, or how so?
the theatrics, that their demands, they're going to want continuances. And another thing that's kind of disturbing, especially for a guy like Rodney Alcala, which there's such a sexual component to these murders, because there was literally, his technique, he would choke these women into unconsciousness. He would rape them, and then he would let them come back to life so that he could do it over and over and over again. And I mean, he would keep them for hours and rape them multiple times. And which is one of the reasons why when we started out with one, it went up on my desk. We had one. no sooner was the ink dry on the return remitter when we made the decision we're going to try them again, even though it's been reversed twice. We started getting DNA hits out of Los Angeles County. So we had three DNA hits in LA. We had one in Orange County, and then we had another one without DNA hits in LA, Jill Parento. And I decided that there was enough evidence there that we wanted to pursue that. And thankfully, they convicted him of all those. But the reason why we had so much DNA is because it's called sperm fraction DNA, which is there was sperm everywhere. So we when Alcala decided to go pro per, we had the judge was a guy named Francisco Briceño, who just passed away. He was a master judicial officer. The guy was phenomenal. And in fact, he came from the DA's office. He is the guy that set up that vertical structure for the Orange County DA's office, where we actually go to the scenes, which is a way better model for prosecuting serious crimes, in my view. So the man was a genius, truly. And Alcala kept coming in, and he had a wonderful attorney named George Peters, who's a good dude, very experienced, and a very good trial attorney. And Alcala, part of the features of these guys is they tend to be a nightmare for their lawyers that are representing them because they're always getting second guessed. They're always, they will perseverate on tiny little meaningless things, and they're very difficult for defense lawyers to deal with oftentimes. And everybody loved George, and I think the judge was finally like, you know what, Mr. Alcala, you've gone through this trial twice. He wrote a book, by the way, called You, the Jury, which was taught at University of Chicago for years as an example of a poor man railroaded by the vicious justice system, before all
Rodney
the DNA hits.
Alcala wrote
Oh
that
yeah, yeah,
book.
yeah.
He
Oh
authored
yes, he
that
did.
book, and oh my
Yes, he
goodness.
did.
Okay.
And it was a sign. There was a professor at University of Chicago who made his students buy that thing every year. So Alcala came in one day complaining about his lawyer for like the 1800th time. And Briceño said, you know what, Mr. Alcala, you're hyper intelligent. You've been through this twice. I believe you would actually do a wonderful job representing yourself. And he let him do it. So on one hand, okay, this is going to be kind of a nightmare. On the other, whatever separates them from humanity, that gets these guys to gain so much enjoyment out of sexual predation on other human beings, whatever it is, and we saw this with Ted Bundy, they are also they're disconnected from the room. When they are in a courtroom, they can't read the room. They don't see what the jury is seeing. And for example, on Rodney Alcala's case, Robin Samso's mother, her name was Marianne Connolly, and she was destroyed by this, especially the three trials. And her life really, she started out as a beautiful young woman, and she crashed and burned as a result of the horrible murder of her 12-year-old girl. She never recovered from it. It was brutal for her family. And so she came in for trial number three. Imagine that, trial number three. And there is Rodney Alcala representing himself, and he's going through over, when you're talking about 20 years of hearings and 20 years of testimony, he did a very meticulous job of finding little inconsistencies, like, well, hey, you use this word to describe it when you testified in 1980 and this word in 86, and now you said this. Like, on a very hyper technical level, his questions were great. Like, it was really like a law student. He would have gotten an A.
And this is his cross-examination of the
This,
mother
yeah, of the
the
mother,
young
right?
girl
So,
that he
so what
murdered
he's
and
doing,
tortured.
right?
She had to endure this. How is that
Right.
watching this happen?
It was horrible and awesome at the same time. There almost should be a new word invented for that, because on one hand, it is horrible because he is beating up on the mother of the girl that he raped, knocked her teeth out, and murdered. Okay, so on one hand, this is horrific, and as a young lawyer, I would have been out of my chair objecting to every question. But as a salty, more experienced DA, as horrible as it was, the jury was repelled by that because all they see is the guy who murdered her daughter calling her a liar. And Napoleon has a great adage that absolutely applies to the craft of trial work, and that is never interrupt your enemy when he's in the process of making a mistake. So we sat there and let Rodney hang himself by going after the mom. And it wasn't We told her he was probably going to do it. We told her what the strategy was. We let her in, like, look, you're gonna have to take one for the team here, because if he is obnoxious, let's let the jury see it. And then if it gets to the point that you can't handle anymore, give me a signal and I will start objecting. And she got it. She let him do it. And it's like, look, answer the questions. And so he was asking questions like, when this man kidnapped your daughter, she's like, you mean when you kidnapped my daughter? And just kept coming back at him like that. So
So complete disassociation from
yeah,
how
he couldn't see what the jury saw. And we're looking at the jury and they're horrified by this spectacle, which is exactly what you want. It's like it's called getting a defendant to flash, or getting them to show their personality, and also his perseveration, his like overwhelming desire to control every person, and you could just see it. And then it allows us to make the argument. Imagine if you're stuck with him and you're a little girl in a van with that guy. Like, imagine what he's like. That's why he's doing this. And so you let him, so it's horrible and awesome at the same time, I think, is the way
So
I
I
can
guess
answer
the
your question.
question was, he was supposedly also charming and believable at some points. Did that side of him, and you actually had a personal encounter with him that was a few seconds of charm, did that part, well, first of all, tell that story, that comment he made to you. It goes with the disassociation, but did the charming side, did the salesman ever come out to the jury?
Yeah, I mean, he certainly tried, but and yeah, look, that's one of the traits. It's in a thing called the Hare Psychopathy Checklist, which was Dr. Hare put together a list of the common um, character features and behavioral features of the psychopath. The Hare Psychopathy Checklist is what it's called. And, grandiosity, extreme narcissism, lack of empathy, those are all on there. But another thing that's on there is superficial charm. So these guys tend to be incredibly charming. Alcala back in the day was a handsome, hyper intelligent young man who had girlfriends, he had friends, he had social success. So there was a moment, of all the training we get as DAs, from, cross examination to, the how to file cases and everything else. The one thing they never train you on is state prison and how it actually works, and what happens in San Quentin on California death row. Like, I was never trained on that. I didn't know. So we had just convicted this guy, Billy Joe Johnson, who was a gnarly swastika tattoo on the face, big 240-pound white supremacist guy, like the scariest of the scary. And he just got convicted of a death penalty case. And the thing is that as a pro per defendant, it means I've got to deal with him like he's opposing counsel, because he is, and I've got to extend professional courtesy to him, and I've got to treat him respectfully, not respectfully, probably the wrong word, but I have to treat him professionally. And that's, part of the thing. It's my professional obligation. And look, a lot of people don't know this, but your job as a prosecutor is to be a backstop and to ensure the procedural fairness against any criminal defendant that you're prosecuting. But it's particularly important in a death penalty case, because you don't want it coming back again for a fourth trial because I did something wrong. So I have to extend him every professional courtesy. So I had to deal with this guy every day for 6 months. And there was a moment where, after we sentenced Billy Joe and he went up to death row, we had a moment. The judge hadn't come out, and we'd been dealing with each other for months. And I'm being, for lack of a better term, I'm being nice to him, because it's better. It moves the case along, and I'm engaging him, and I'm trying to have as much constructive, conversation as I can, as far as exhibits and marking them, things that he wants. And there's 1,000 things a day that you have to deal with during the course of a trial with opposing counsel. And for this, I'm dealing with Rodney Alcala for hours. So we at this moment before the judge came out, and I'm like, hey, Rodney, what happens when guys like Billy Joe go up to death row? And I'm picturing it's just one death row. Turns out what they do in San Quentin is they do a sub classification for death row, where when you go to jail, they classify you. It's the first thing they do. Are you violent? Are you a gang member? Are you a danger to staff? you go through these classifications, and if you get sent to prison, they do the same thing. And then there's another classification on death row. They try to determine, is this guy dangerous or not dangerous? Like Scott Peterson was and this is a name the inmates gave themselves for the non-violent, the non-dangerous, not non-violent, of course, but the non-dangerous, the low risk to staff. They call it the weenie yard. So they're in a building with their own outside enclosed area that's called their yard, and it was the weenie yard. And so I'm like, what happens? And I didn't know any of that. And I'm like, so what happens, when a guy like Billy Joe doesn't it make you nervous? Like, aren't you on the target list? And he turns to me and he's like, Matt, like, buddy, like he's going to the heavy yard. I'm on the weenie yard. Like, I'm not a threat. I'm not violent. And Rodney Alcala, murder of 100 people who smashed faces in with rocks and raped women with hammers, tells me I'm not violent. Like, what are you talking about? Like, how can you think that about me? Like, we've been, like we're getting
That
along great.
switch, that mental switch right there. How do you classify that? How do you characterize when a human being is capable of that switch? Or is it just a big facade cover up? Is it playing the part of, I didn't do this? I mean, or is there really a switch? They turn it on,
Oh,
turn it off.
I think
They're a
that
part of
he
society, they ravage it.
in his mind, and look, he wasn't a danger to other inmates, and he wasn't a danger to staff. So if you spend a couple decades up there, you are given privileges commensurate with your low risk status in that environment. So in his mind, he wasn't violent. He's never been in a fight in jail. He's not going to attack staff. And he was offended at the idea that he would ever even cross paths with a guy like, and it's just so he believes it as he's saying it, which is one of the things in that superficial charm sort of way. It's almost like, you know, I think we can pull out a million examples. OJ is one of them. Like it's almost like he knew he committed those murders. Sorry for any of your fans who think he didn't. He
Believe
did.
otherwise, right?
Yeah, and he was perfectly capable of turning on the charm, and but Alcala in that context, he was actually offended that I would think that. And there's a fascinating interview with Ted Bundy that people can find on YouTube with a reporter. I think it was the night before his execution, his actual execution. So
Yes.
he's been marked a million times, and he keeps getting midnight reprieves, where one last appeal will be. And he was a law student at the time, and he the reporter says, just out of curiosity, what's it like to know that you're going to be executed tomorrow? Like this is your last day. And he kind of laughs and he goes, the odds of me being executed tomorrow are about the same as you getting killed in a car accident on the way home. And then he goes, God forbid that should happen. And it's just this moment, and it's this thing where superficial charm, right? He's like, oh my goodness, forgive me for saying something so grossly inconsiderate. Like, of course I don't want you to die. Like, that's the superficial charm that the psychopaths use. And they juiced that friggin' guy the next day. Which,
I think
sorry,
there's
sorry,
also a
sorry.
factor.
Yeah.
No, but yeah, well, there's different opinions on the death penalty, and he's definitely worthy of that. But there also is a people person factor, a chameleon factor to a lot of these guys as well, where they can absorb themselves. And I don't know, you would think that it's a lack of empathy, a lack of compassion, or they can just read it well to go up to these strangers and get that moment where their victim is chosen and they have access to that victim. Would you say that there's some social aspect to it, or do you think that it's just more trickery?
You hit on a really, really good point. And look, one of the reasons why Jack the Ripper was never found is that, again, it's one of the myths of serial killers. We're all looking for Buffalo Bill, the character from Silence of the Lambs, the creepy guy in the van with the fake cast who lives in a creepier house on the hill with a well in the middle of it, and it puts the lotion on the basket. That's the archetype that we all have in our minds of the serial killer. The reality is, and the reason why Jack the Ripper, I believe, was never caught, is that guy could commit that and walk right into the streets of Whitechapel, London in the 1800s and immediately fit in. That's why The BTK killer got away with it. That guy was active in his church group. That's why Jeffrey Dahmer got away with it. That's why, there's so many, and Rodney Alcala worked for the LA Times when he was committing these murders. I mean, that is, they, they are, they are socially functional. So many of them. A lot of them are married. A lot of them have kids. A lot of them have successful businesses. So that's the thing. We want Buffalo Bill, the creepy guy that we can all spot a mile away. The scary reality of these guys is they could be in line in front of you at Walmart and you would never know. The guy ordering in front of you in Starbucks very well could be a psychopath, and it's a primal thing for us. We all want to know. It's like we're mammals, right? Like we want to be able to spot the predator. If it's got big teeth, even if we know what it is, it's probably dangerous. If it's slithering on the ground, it's probably dangerous, right? Like we want to be able to spot the danger. And in truth, when we're talking about other humans, these are intraspecies predators, and part of it is camouflage. And in order to be successful, they fit in, and that's why they're so freaking hard to catch. And that's one of the fascinating things about serial killers.
Well, so it is fascinating. And we're going to wrap up Rodney Alcala because there's a few other things to get to, but I have to know any final words from him when he was convicted? Did he say anything
No,
to you?
no. It was an interesting thing. He got sentenced and expressionless and all that. I did have a serial killer, Andrew Urdiales, who when it came down to the sentencing, the jury came back and all of them were there for the sentencing, and he gave what's known as a statement of allocution, which we're about to see in the Kohberger case, I think, where he addressed the family and said my condolences, which was kind of an interesting, and he had all these different, million victims, that guy too. My condolences to the family. And part of the penalty phase of that was we went through his whole Marine Corps career, and I asked the jury to consider positively his contribution to the country. He came back with combat medals from the Gulf War. It's like, ladies and gentlemen, please give him his due. Those are important things. You have to consider that. But here are the reasons why I believe that it is still outweighed by the horror and by the circumstance of death. So anyway, he comes in, he's given his statement in allocution. He says, my condolences to the family. And he said, I see the jury here today. And I would just like to let the jury know that if I were on the jury with you folks, I would have reached the same conclusion that you did. Really interesting, right? So I'm thinking he's blowing smoke, whatever. Goes up, and this guy had been on death row in Illinois before it was commuted, then in Indiana before it was commuted by the governors of those two states, respectively, for all these sex workers he was murdering in Chicago when he was first caught. So he's a professional death row inmate at that point. California death row is probably the easiest in all of the United States for the guys that are on it, frankly. And
Right.
but he made that statement. If I were you, I would have done the same thing. And then he got up there and he carried out the execution himself, and he hanged himself in his cell within 3 or 4 weeks of his arrival in San Quentin. And he carried out the sentence himself. Really, really kind of an interesting thing that surprised me because most of the time they don't have enough feeling to be depressed, these guys.
So
So,
I covered another case like that, sentenced to death row, and one of the guys ended up hanging himself because he was in his goodbye letter, if you will, in prison, frustrated over the system and the red tape around killing him.
yeah,
And I just thought that was fascinating.
yeah.
Kohberger, so a lot of mixed opinions about the plea deal. How would you, first of all, characterize Kohberger within this realm, in this new thought process of serial killers today?
So technically, he does not meet the FBI definition, which is two or more victims at different events. Okay, so all we
So
know
that's
about is
key. So you're saying that's the definition of a true serial killer. It has to be at different events.
no. That is the FBI definition of what it takes to be a serial killer. I, with no criticism of the FBI, I personally disagree with that. I think that when we do that and we make that the definition, number one, that includes drug dealers who can shoot straight, who are or gang members who can shoot straight, or mercy killings in hospitals, right? Like those are two or more murders spaced apart at different events. That's a totally different thing than what we're talking about, the true serial killers. And it also discounts in the modern era of DNA, that guy, the psychopath, the one who's getting off on it, who's working his way up to his first killing, who gets caught after a couple of rapes. or the guy who gets caught after one murder, but he's sexually motivated by it. Like I had a guy, Jason Balcom, who he was a serial rapist who then graduated into murder. He had so many rapes. He was so prolific. He was so violent. He murdered a 22-year-old pregnant, newlywed Mormon woman in broad daylight in Costa Mesa. And we finally got a DNA hit on it, and we were able to prosecute him for that. But he did all that, and he hadn't even turned 19 yet. So, so a true serial killer, I think, includes people that are it's the same guy, even if they just get one. That's how I view Kohberger. I think that Kohberger was when you look at his letters that he wrote, he has like some diary entries that were released where he talks about how he feels now. He feels empty inside. All of that again. If you go down the hair psychopathy checklist, he ticks so many boxes on that. So, and I think, look, the DA Thompson got in and he said there's no sexual component. I don't know how he can say that because he wasn't in Kohberger's mind. But the guy who breaks into the house in the middle of the night after he's obsessed with some
Stalking.
beautiful woman with a knife in his hand, I don't think he's there to ask her for the prom. Like that's a guy, there is a sexual component to that, almost certainly. Again, FBI has already studied that. A large majority of these guys do sexually abuse their victims. And those that don't sometimes just don't have the opportunity because, like this, his plan, whatever it was, went pear-shaped and there was a second woman in the bed and then that Ethan kid comes down probably and his plan, there's a dog in there, his plan it did not go to plan. So with Kohberger, I totally think that he fits all of the categories, just not the academic one. But I think that when you look at what he was doing, you look at the obsession. He was obsessed with Ted Bundy. That's one of the pieces of information it's been reported multiple times. I don't know if it's true because the gag order was just lifted today, and I haven't had a chance to go through all the evidence in that. But I think he's that guy. Right after, remember, there's a selfie that he took. There's actually two. One where he's got the hoodie up, which he looks like a vampire, and another one he's giving a thumbs up with a evil looking grin on his face. That's that dude. That's the serial killer. That's a psychopath. Maybe there was a change in circumstances that we don't know. I, in my view, and the view of some of my colleagues who have also prosecuted death cases that I've spoken to since they took that deal, we're all scratching our heads. They had a great judge. The evidence was overwhelming. They're going to get a death qualified jury in the state of Idaho. It's just like your stars are aligned at that point. And there are some very good reasons for giving somebody LWOP or life without parole, because it eliminates a lot of the appellate process and some of the issues. You don't have these zealous anti-death penalty attorneys that have dedicated their life. There are advantages to the family. There's really good reasons, but all of that should have been factored in when the decision was made to seek death in the first place. So maybe there's a change in circumstance that we don't know about yet that caused the DA. I would be really disappointed if it was just Kohberger decided he wanted to plead guilty. They all want to plead guilty on the eve of trial because the only person they really care about are themselves. And in Idaho, there's a very good possibility he would actually have been executed at some point. So
So you actually
I
think
don't
it's
know
related to
everything.
the
I haven't
death
seen the reports that DA saw, but I was shocked that they did that, and the disconnection with the Gonzalez family in particular, in my view. If what they said is true, that they were notified of that via an email 48 hours before it went down, if
That's
that
rad.
if that's true, and I don't know that it is, if it's true, that should never ever happen.
Yeah, every prosecutor I talked to about it really disappointed in that news. So how does this? I want to go back to this definition because it's really interesting, and I think it has impact on a broader scale. So is it? It's not necessarily what defines a serial killer, the amount of killings in a time frame, but it has a location factor, and just weave that in with school shooters.
I think school shooters are I think that's a different animal. Sorry for lack of a better term. I think it's a different thing. I think that under what a psychologist would say is that that's known as a spree killing, where somebody gets and just goes on and kills as many people as they can. That's a different thing than that cold-hearted, predatory, sexual hunter that goes out there, and like the Ted Bundys. That's a different thing. And I think a lot of the school shooters, I think they are social outcasts, and a lot of them were bullied, and I think it's a different psychological constellation that leads to that.
Well, I have to know because we have breaking news a little bit with Maurene Comey. She was fired. So, for people that don't know, let's backtrack a little bit. She was pivotal in the Jeffrey Epstein case, and she was very successful there. Maxwell, very successful there. A lot of disappointment in the outcome of P. Diddy's trial. I think it was a major letdown. I think it was a universal, nationwide sigh is how could this happen? First, do you think it's the specific charges of the approach, and what do you make of the firing? Is this political? Is it a message? Is it just sheer disappointment?
Well, number one, look, and I commented on this very early on, and I actually got a little bit of heat for it. But this was always an odd fit for a federal case. Okay, so when you're talking about RICO, RICO is designed to go after corrupt organizations like the mafia, criminal enterprises that are essentially ongoing conspiracies. And Bad Boy Records was a legitimate, musical enterprise. It didn't really fit. And that's one of the fundamental elements of that. And I think the prosecution did a pretty darn good job of explaining that, but they did so in they have to, as they go through the law, kind of a stiff, professorial, kind of wonky, legalese way to say, hey, ladies and gentlemen, these are the reasons why it fits. And then a lot of the crimes they listed as what are known as predicate acts in order to satisfy RICO. So that's where, like the arson and things like that. What we saw in that video should have been prosecuted as a state crime. And it should have been prosecuted. So should the arson have been prosecuted. But in
Yes.
Los Angeles, a lot of people don't know this, we went through an era of a guy named George Gascon, who the former DA of LA was a woman named Jackie Lacey, who's a personal friend of mine.
Mm.
I think she was a great DA. Law enforcement really liked her. She did a fantastic job. Lifelong Democrat, first female DA of LA County, first African American DA of LA County. She was awesome. Okay, just awesome. And as a result, we wound up with a guy. The nickname was Captain Freedom for law enforcement, calling that because he wanted to let everybody go except for cops. He was the former DA of
He
San
rocked the
Francisco.
city, right? He did a lot
The,
of, in my opinion, damage to the
he
city,
is the
short term,
worst
long
thing.
term.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
he is the worst thing that happened to public safety in LA, where I grew
yeah.
up, in the history of LA. He was horrific, and he lost the re-election to a guy named Nathan
Well, it
Hochman,
took the city a long
who's
time to realize that because of the way California leans, they had to see it over a duration of time, unfortunately, to see it for
the
themselves.
explosion. You're exactly right. The explosion of crime in LA. It's his fault, flat out. And when he came in, he was hostile to the career prosecutors. He went after police officers. He's absolutely horrible to victims. I represented two families of murdered police officers against what George Gascon was trying to do. The guy was a nightmare. But anyway, so that's the era where the statute basically ran on what Diddy had done in a state contest. What we saw in that video should have been prosecuted in state court in front of a jury in downtown LA. And it was horrific. It should have been prosecuted there. So it was a very difficult federal case. I tip my hat to the effort on that. But it wasn't a good fit. Sex trafficking also was all the consensual elements of that were always going to be a problem. And the jury convicted him, as I think they should have, of the Mann Act violations. But the Mann Act it's a morality crime. It was enacted around the turn of the last century, so 125 years ago. And it was essentially a way for them to go after pimps that were transporting prostitutes across state lines back when we used to call them prostitutes. Right now we call them sex
Right.
workers. But I had a friend of mine who put it very simply. He said, every lonely divorced guy in New York City who engages the services of a sex worker and pays for her Uber to come across that bridge or through one of those tunnels is committing a Mann Act violation because they are facilitating the transportation of a sex worker across state lines. And that's what it takes. So the jury convicted him of that. I would be surprised if he gets a whole lot of time for that, frankly, because it is a morality crime and he was acquitted of the most serious crimes. So
I don't
I'm
think he'll get a lot of
hesitant.
time. Yeah.
Yeah, I really don't think
Yeah,
he
I
will
don't think
either.
there's a. And so, do you think the firing of Maurene Comey is from the action she took on this trial, or do you think there's this looming bigger picture, this political message that everyone's whispering about?
Um, I I really hope not. And I mean, the answer is I don't know. Okay, and I the infection of the prosecutorial world with politics is something that I witnessed firsthand, and it is a toxic cocktail. When you mix those things, it should never happen. And also, I'm a huge believer that nobody should be. I don't think this is controversial. Nobody should pay for the sins of their father. And also, look, I understand why President Trump hates Comey. And her dad has done pretty much everything he can to inject politics into the FBI. I'm not a Comey fan at all, not from a political perspective, but from a law enforcement perspective. And I got FBI friends that work for that agency that hated that guy's guts. So, but I really, really hope that it's not related to that. I mean, it certainly looks like it is. Answer is I don't know. I don't know her. Thankfully, I don't do political commentary. I stay as far away from it as I can.
Right? It's
I
tough.
don't think that. I mean, look, she was doing the work of a prosecutor. She went after a guy who certainly appeared to many of us to be a villain. And going after Diddy. And from a prosecutorial slash law enforcement slash citizen of this country standpoint, I sort of, on one hand, I applaud the effort. On the other, I never thought it was a very good case. I hate to be proven right, or maybe I'm glad to be proven right on that. I don't know, but he's presumed innocent. He was acquitted. That's all good. But boy, oh boy, I hope that she's not. I hope that firing was not from losing that case. And I really hope it's not related to her dad. And answer the, I mean, again, I just don't know.
And talking about politics, which we're seeing more of, I think, is political murders and political targeted killings. Mangione is the huge headline in that trial. Who knows what's going to be the end result of that? But my question would be, are you seeing this spike as well, this message oriented killing versus sexual pleasure, entitlement, thirst for it? Is that something you're concerned about? And how do you think the Mangione case will actually go before a jury?
I think it will because I don't think they're ever going to offer him anything. And I think that Mangione's the type of guy who's going to want that platform. And I think that his defense team right now, he has excellent lawyers on his side. I think they're going to be hard pressed to keep him off the stand. And ultimately, it's the client's call. He's going to want to spout his ideology. So I think that that's a product of the overheated political rhetoric of our time. And look, I think that there's a lack of responsibility really on both sides of the political spectrum right now. Like you can fire up your base and try to get them to vote by calling everybody Hitler or by calling everybody communist. Like you can really do that and you can motivate people to go to the voting booth. But Jesus freaking Christ, guys, you're also motivating the loonies who are going to come out of the woodwork and like the guy that tried to kill Donald Trump. Don't tell me that that didn't have an effect on the election, or Mangione who murdered an innocent man. That guy was innocent, shot him in the back of the head, and that is, I really these people that come out of the woodwork, Melissa, that like Kohberger had a group of people called the Pro Burgers who wanted to spar with everybody and say how innocent he was. Like, guys, he pled guilty. Like he's not. There's no alleged anymore. We can drop that word from our discussion. He actually did it, and he came to court and he admitted it. It's the same thing on Mangione. Like that guy had kids. He's a president of a company. There's so much crazy he deserved it, and it's in f you all. Like you've
And
never
that's
been to
what's
a
so
murder scene.
scary because they're young, they're intelligent, they're educated, they come from good families, they have access to a lot of things that other people their age would kill to have access to.
That's right.
And this is, they could easily go and change the world in a different way, carry a different path, but this is the choice that they made.
Yeah.
And I
And
think that's
who else
scary.
is on the list? Who else deserves to die in your political lexicon? Let us know now, so that we can figure that out, and maybe, maybe they're willing to kill themselves for you. Who else is next? Who else is it okay to murder in the United States? And I'll tell you what, a huge part of my job was being there when the death notification was given to family members, and the apoplectic grief that a wife or a mother or a child goes through when they find out that their loved one has been murdered is something that nobody should ever have to experience. And for those that celebrate that, shame on every single one of you. And if you live long enough, God forbid any of you have a circumstance where a loved one of yours is the victim of murder, because I guarantee at the end of that experience, you will hate the people that come out and celebrate them and want to cheer for them. I think it's morally wrong to do that. I think it's repugnant, and I'm happy to debate any of them anytime, anywhere. That's wrong.
No, I'm with you. And as a journalist, talking to these family members to shed light or justice for their loved one, it's brutal. It guts you. And we're going to wrap this up with learning more about Matt Murphy. I know, covering crime for all these years, I have my own method of disconnecting and balancing. What's the Matt Murphy way? How do you decompress? How do you reset when you're feeling heavy?
I ride my electric bike down to the Manhattan Beach Pier. That's what I do.
It's an
Um,
awesome bike.
yeah, no, I like to surf. I like to I love to scuba dive. I've got a great bunch of friends. I like to play golf. Love to travel, and I try to balance it out as much as I can. Sometimes more successfully than others. But we all have those stressors in life, and I think it's critical to try to find a balance. And anybody who's interested, they can read about my failure to balance it and maintain successful romantic relationships in
The
my
Book
book,
of
The Book of
Murder,
Murder. Yeah.
which is so beautifully written. It is so good, and it should be on the big screen. It should be a TV series because your life is unbelievable. But there has to be a way that you've lived your life and endured certain things to where you can endure grief of others. And it gets piled on over the years. Is that something you learned as you went along, or is that something that you took from growing up a certain way?
Well, as a
My point is,
prosecutor,
not everyone can do it.
yeah, as a prosecutor, you have a lot of power over those situations because you get to decide who gets charged. You get to decide when there's enough evidence. You get to decide how the case proceeds through the court system, and you're ultimately up there the one that is making that closing argument, really arguing on behalf of the person who can't argue for themselves anymore. And so that there's a release for me that a lot of people don't have, because I get to, it sounds corny, but I get to, as a prosecutor, you get to deliver justice to the victim's family, and that's something that you can do. So there's an outlet. You see the most horrible thing, but you also, your faith in people, gets restored too, because you're there and you got a dead body on the floor, and then right next to the dead body is some crime lab person working tirelessly to deliver justice to the family and to make it right. And then you get together with the detectives and you see these wonderful people that come in that do everything they can to make it right to the extent it can be made right, to hold the bad guy responsible or the bad woman, to the greatest degree the law will allow. And it is important for the families. So when you're in the position of being a detective or a prosecutor, you can do something about it, for lack of a better word. So there is an outlet there. And then if you mix that in with as much surfing, golf, and scuba diving as possible, it helps.
Do you see life differently from everything you've seen over the years, and do you see people differently?
Um, I think that I wouldn't say differently. I'd say that my view has evolved, and I think that I really did. I left that job after 26 years with a real sense of optimism because, again, you've got one bad guy that does something horrible, And then you've got 20 heroes that come in and take the swabs in the middle of the night and find the DNA. And I mean, I cannot tell you how many of those I saw over the years. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my book. I really wanted to give some credit to the people behind the scenes that nobody ever hears from. And I think that's a worthy thing. And look, I was deeply honored to be able to do that and to be able to work with those wonderful people for as many years as I did.
The Book of Murder. Thank you, Matt Murphy, for this great, enlightening. I can't wait for your second book. It's going to happen. I know it. You're a brilliant writer. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, and I can't wait to come back.
All right.